This is our first event as conveners and also our first online group event as well, so a lot of firsts. With that in mind, we're going to just direct you to some of our kind of online and social media. So we have a website through the BISA page, which Katarina will put a link to in the chat. We're also on Twitter at BISA_Southeast Europe, which is just SEE_working group. And we also have an email, which is seewg.group@bisa.ac.uk. Please do follow us and get in touch if you'd like more info about the group or have an idea for an event. We're really open to kind of chatting to people and other people getting involved. So yeah, please do get in touch. Yeah, so on to the main event. Memory in Southeast Europe, Global Currents of Activism and Contestation. So memory has really been a very contested and contentious issue within the region. But it's also, I guess, often thought of at the level of elite politics and elite history. With this panel, we really wanted to also recognise the role of grassroots actors, both in resisting and reifying these memory narratives. The idea for the roundtable emerged from a panel that was planned for BISA 2020, which was unfortunately cancelled due to the pandemic. But we still kind of wanted to do something around these topics, especially due to some of the events that were happening in the region in the past few months. So when we originally wrote the abstract, we're in the midst of protests responding to the Bleiberg mass that was held in Sarajevo, as well as the ruling on the Perković Thompson case in Croatia. We're quite conscious that a lot has happened since then. For example, kind of some of the targeted violence in the Montenegrin elections. And we really encourage our panelists and audience members to kind of help us reflect on some of these developments. Then just to say that when we were thinking of the framing of the roundtable, we were also really conscious of some of the international and global currents of memory politics, both in and of Southeast Europe. So we also really invite panelists and audience members to reflect on the kind of global echoes, connections and currents, and also kind of this activist and solidarity movements, which are sort of countering memory narratives. So the questions that we've kind of set out for the panel are the following. In what ways have silence, denial and its contestation been manifest? How and why have particular actors shaped and influenced memory politics? In what ways are memories contested? By whom? And what global or transnational connections can we draw between memory politics and activism in the region? So we have 3 speakers today, each of whom is going to speak for just about 10 minutes on their research and activism around these topics. We've deliberately tried to keep the interventions quite brief to facilitate a longer Q&A session. We know this is quite a popular topic, so I imagine there'll be plenty of comments and questions afterwards. So if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. Now I guess I'll hand over to Katarina for the introductions and to hand over to the presentations as well.
Great. Thank you, Lydia, for the introduction. I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists. And I know that we're probably all tired of Zoom events, but I think one benefit is that we managed to get quite diverse people together in one, even if it's a virtual room. So I think I'm very, very happy that we have such a great lineup that I think wouldn't be possible without a pandemic keeping us at our laptops. So there is a silver lining here. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then if they want to add anything else, they'll do so in their talks. So we have Ana Milošević, Jelena Đurejnović, and Jasmin Mujanovic. Ana Milošević is a political scientist and a monument hunter. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Leuven Institute of Criminology, where she's working on the project Memorializing Terror, Remembrance, and Social Recovery After Terrorist Attacks. And I believe that she's looking at memory and memorialization projects following the Brussels attacks, the Paris attacks, and the Manchester arena bombing. She's published widely on the topic of memory in Southeast Europe. And out of the many publications that you can find online, I'll just mention the quite recent co-edited volume on Europeanization and memory politics in the Western Balkans, And I think very relevant to our topic, she's also co-chairing the regional group on Southeast European memory that was recently founded within the Memory Studies Association. Jelena is now a scientific coordinator of the research platform for the study of Eastern Europe and transformations at the University of Vienna. So congratulations, Jelena, on the new post. Her main research interests include memory studies, nationalism studies, post-socialism, history of Yugoslavia and the post-Yugoslav space. And again, out of the many publications, I'll just mention her recent book, The Politics of Memory of the Second World War in Contemporary Serbia, Collaboration, Resistance, and Retribution. And Jelena is also the coordinator of the memory program at the Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade, Serbia, which is one of the biggest and most important organizations when it comes to memory politics in Southeast Europe. And lastly, we have Jasmin Mujanovic, who is a political scientist specializing in the politics of post-authoritarian and post-conflict democratization. His first book, Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, examines the persistence of authoritarian and illiberal forms of governments in the Western Balkans since the end of the Yugoslav wars. Again, he's published very widely in both academic publications, but also in the media. He's originally from Sarajevo, and he's currently a policy consultant for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Dialogue Southeast Europe office, and he's the co-host of, I think, very popular podcast, Sarajevo Calling, a podcast of Southeast European affairs. So without further ado, we'll now move to the interesting part, and I'd first ask Anna for her presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for presenting me, Katarina, and maybe I should just add a few more words about what I'm going to say today. So today I'm planning on dividing my really short presentation into two parts. So firstly, I want to say a few more words about this new working group that has been formed within the Memory Studies Association that is actually focusing on Southeast Europe and on memory politics in general, on memory in general. And in the second place, I want to talk about the paper that I was supposed to present actually this year at the BISA conference 2020, that is actually talking about contestation and memory, comparing different cases. So first of all, maybe just to say a few more words about memory in general and the state of art of memory studies in the region of Southeast Europe. So as you said, as I also mentioned, the Memory Studies Association has given us the opportunity actually to form this kind of new regional group on Southeast Europe that is actually, for what we know, actually the first working group that has ever existed on memory studies in the region. So I'm co-chairing this group, and it is really, really recent, and Jelena is also a member of this group. I'm co-chairing this group with Vjeran Pavlaković from University of Rijeka and Naum Trojanovski, who is actually with the Academy of Sciences in Poland. And I'm gonna put in the chat now our newly formed website for people who are maybe interested into learning more about a working group, what we do, what we plan to do, etc., etc. As you will see also on the website, we also are trying to kind of give an overview of the state of the art of the research on memory in the region, which is not really easy because we have a lot of political scientists that have been dealing with memory. We have memory scholars, we have historians, we have a number of different kind of scientists that have been dealing in this that way with memory of the region. And of course, when we say we are all dealing with the memory studies and the memory politics in the region, we always think along the lines of First World War, the Second World War, and we also often think about the Yugoslav wars, especially in the Balkan regions. So I would like you to consult the website and maybe see if this interests you and whether you can join our group and maybe support our work. And we're also planning on organizing an interesting, I think, panel next year in Warsaw for the Conference of Memory Studies Association. So secondly, what I wanted to present today is actually the research that I was supposed to present this year at the conference, which is actually dealing with contestation, memory and contestation. So the paper that me and two of my colleagues sent for the panel on memory in Southeast Europe is actually dealing with contestation of different kind of memory occurrences in Europe. And one among those cases was actually a case of David Dragicevic in Banja Luka. Another one was the memorial after the terrorist attacks in Brussels. And the third one was a memorial that was made for Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese journalist who was killed a few years ago in Malta. So what we wanted to examine in that paper was actually how memorials are contested, by whom memorials are contested, and how we contest memory. So who are the main actors? How do they contest the official or unofficial memory politics, et cetera, et cetera. So what I think is actually important in that paper, and what we also suggested in our conclusions, is this relationship between the official and unofficial memory. We intentionally examined spontaneous memorials as because spontaneous memorials, as we saw them in our paper, are actually seen as this kind of like a democratic memory, the way that society expresses itself. It's an unorganized, spontaneous way of commemorating and remembering the events that happened in the past, or maybe they happened just in that particular moment, because spontaneous memorials often emerge immediately after a traumatic event, or in relation or as a contestation to what is a certain official narrative. So these are only 3 examples, but as we know, around the region, there are different ways of actually contesting the official politics of memory that are not only through the form of spontaneous memorials, but also by organizing protest, memorial activism, et cetera, et cetera. So what we compared actually in this paper that is hopefully going to be published soon is actually we look at what is the memorial purpose of this kind of memorial activism. So we were looking how these actors who actually create spontaneous memorials, what kind of memorial purposes do they assign to memorials and memorialization in general. So what we have seen comparing these 3 cases was actually really, really interesting for us, because we saw that memorialization is not the building of spontaneous memorials, and the memorial activism is not only geared, not only directed towards a memory itself of the person who is being commemorated, but is also a political activism. It's a way of seeking truth and justice. Especially in the case in Banja Luka, and especially in the case of Valletta, while in Brussels it was a bit different because it was a apolitical kind of event. So we also in this paper compared what were not only who were the actors and what they were trying to achieve with these memorialization processes, but we were also looking what were the outcomes. So what actually happens, when you make a spontaneous memorial, you go on the street, you protest, you seek justice, you seek a truth about what happened to a certain person or in relation to a certain event. So we look at also what were the outcomes of these protests and these memorial occurrences. So what we have seen is actually that these kind of memorial activism can result also in removal and complete repression, like for instance in Banja Luka. So I'm sure that everybody knows, actually maybe I was supposed to maybe say a few words more about the case itself in Banja Luka, but I'm sure you're already familiar with the David Dragicevic case, because it has been in press for so many years. But in that case in particular, it was quite visible that you know, the political establishment tried to depoliticize violently also the public space, and it led towards complete erasure of that kind of memory and that kind of political activism in public sphere. And in other two cases, it led towards spontaneous decay, and in Brussels, it was more positive relation between political authorities and the society itself. So the outcome was very, very positive in terms of preserving memory, while in Valletta, in also where there is a really complicated relationship between memorial activists and NGOs that are trying to preserve memory of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and they are also fighting for truth and justice. In this case also, there was a transformation of public space, and it also led towards removal of memorial, continuous removal, continuous rebuilding of spontaneous memorial to keep the memory and keep the process of fighting for justice. So this is briefly maybe just the summary of our paper that maybe seems a bit complicated, because apparently it compares three completely different cases, but three cases that actually have a lot of things in common. Because as you know, as you also mentioned, Katarina, I have been recently dealing with spontaneous memorials. I have been dealing with this kind of bottom-up memory, which is completely different from what I did in the past, what I did for my PhD and what my book is about, that I co-edited with Tamara Trost on Europeanization and memory politics. So for this book and for my PhD project, I have been looking more at the top-down processes, how the official politics of memory is formed and is projected to the society. And what I'm looking at now is how this bottom-up memory comes to surface in the first place, and what are the roles that are assigned to memorialization by society itself. So I think this paper is going to be interesting reading, because it brings two perspectives together, and we are trying to understand in this paper what is this clash between the official and societal ways of remembering, and what do they clash about, and how do they clash about the memory, what is official memory, what is the truth, and what kind of memorial purposes all these actors from the state, government, politicians, victims association, victims' families, what kind of memorial purposes do they assign to memorialization, and how do they use memorialization? Because we should not forget that everybody, all the actors that are involved in the memorialization processes, assign different kind of roles to memorialization. And of course, when I'm saying this, I think that the official politics of memory that is usually formed after 1 year, okay, for the official anniversary, the first anniversary of certain events, it kind of gives the framing of what happened, how it happened, okay? It gives the story, the overarching story about a certain event. And the spontaneous memorials and the societal processes when it comes to memorialization, they evolve over time. So they are quite different in the moment when the people, like terrorist attack happened and people go on the streets and they use candles, they bring flowers, and they use this kind of moment, and they use memorialization as a tool to process what had happened. Okay. And
sorry,
then,
Anna, just to interrupt for a
yeah.
second, could you just wrap up in kind of 30 seconds, a minute?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I said like at the beginning that I'm going to be really brief, and then I start talking. Okay. So to kind of wrap up. Okay. So this paper, actually, I hope it's going to be a really interesting reading, because it's going to bring these two perspectives together: the top-down and the bottom-up approaches to memory, and it's gonna bring some new, I think, conclusions on the impact of contestation on memorialization in general. So I'm gonna stop here. So if there are any questions, I'm here and available.
Thanks very much, Anna, that was great. I think now we'll hand over to Jelena and hear from you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I will also try to be very brief. I intend to be very, very brief. I'll talk a bit about some of my main research topics and the topics I deal with as working in the Humanitarian Law Center as well, beyond academia. So the primary topics of my work on memory in Southeast Europe are about the memory of the Second World War and Socialist Yugoslavia, and then also about the 90s wars, on which I particularly focus within my current research project that I'm going to do, start doing next week when in Vienna, and also what I do in the Humanitarian Law Center. So just a bit about my current research topic, and I think I will touch upon that a bit towards the end of my talk. I intend, it's a quite theory-oriented project, and I intend to define some specific features of memory politics in competitive authoritarianism in the current political context, or populist memory politics in the current global political context. Serbia is my theory-building case study, obviously, as the context I know much better than any other. But then I will also look into Hungary to test some of my ideas there, and also because of some similar tendencies that take place in politics in both countries. But also I intend, this is I think something really important for this when we talk about memory in the post-Yugoslav space as well, I intend to go beyond the post-conflict and post-socialist context, because I don't think that they necessarily define memory politics in these countries, but it's more traveling and transnational, also within right-wing populism and authoritarianism. So Anna mentioned some perspectives, top-down versus bottom-up. I combine both in the sense that during my entire research path, I've been always interested in right-wing and illiberal civil society and their memory activism. So this is something I'm also doing now. While I look at top-down memory politics coming from state institutions, I'm also interested in different, really memory activism coming from below, but it comes from these mostly right-wing, nationalist, illiberal actors that are very often overlooked as agents of memory. So, and this is where I also have some ethnographic leanings in my research, and maybe during the Q&A we can look into it a bit more, because I also did interviews with many of the Chetnik memory community members, for example. At the moment, in addition to doing research, I'm also a coordinator of memory activism program in the Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade. And this program is kind of how I see it is also that it's kind of a response to the sudden interest of the political elites in Serbia in the events, for the events of the 90s wars, and their turn towards commemorating the 90s. And the memory industry that came out of it also means that the civil society in the region, in Serbia and also in the post-Yugoslav space, must make this kind of turn towards engaging more, not only in memory activism, but also expert commentary and critique of memory politics, confronting some of the mnemonic agents coming from the state with facts, because memory politics in the Serbian case is also about facts distortion. But to say something a bit broadly, I think it would be a good way to start the discussion about memory in the region, a bit about memory politics in Serbia over the last 20 years. When it comes to memory of the 20th century in general, including the 90s, I explore anti-communism and ethnicization as the two dominant prisms of historical interpretation within state-sanctioned memory politics in Serbia. So after the overthrow of Slobodan Milošević in 2000, the main tendency was going towards separation from and delegitimizing socialist Yugoslavia and all its legacies in many different spheres, including memory politics. Othering of Yugoslavia was also very important, and everything it stood for, and that was supposed to provide legitimacy for the new political elites that originated from the opposition to Slobodan Milošević in the 90s. And they were united in this kind of anti-communist consensus that was the main marker of memory politics. And then what we saw after 2000 is that references to socialist Yugoslavia disappeared from the public sphere, including, for example, street names, names of other institutions, factories, and so on. And partisans, the People's Liberation Movement, were recast as perpetrators, while their enemies and Axis collaborators were often recast as heroes. And this is what my research was about, and my book as well, about the reinterpretation of the Chetnik movement in particular. But now in this time, since 2012, since the Serbian Progressive Party came to power, we have the rise of populism, and at the same time, this lens of ethnicization of history achieved dominance over anti-communism. And this is most evident in different revivals of the anti-fascist commemorations, including the Victory Day, Liberation Days, and so on, where the political elites, as ridiculous as it might sound, they embrace the Yugoslav partisans as a positive reference, and they celebrate them, however, as a Serbian army and as the proof that the Serbian nation has always stood on the right side. So, of course, this revival is also related, I will refer to that a bit at the end. It also relates to the EU accession process and always closer relations with the Russian Federation. And of course, there are different effects of Russian memory diplomacy that are coming into play here. And there is also really unprecedented militarization of commemorative practices as well, that I think were not even the case in socialist Yugoslavia at this level like now. So if you look at Serbia in the kind of international context, of course, there are some national and regional specificities in the Serbian case, and they need to be historicized, but Serbia also reflects the global rise of authoritarianism and populism, and memory politics is part of that tendency. So the narrative that underlies the current memory politics in Serbia is about, and you can see that really in the global context in many countries, is about returning pride to the Serbian nation, about celebrating the glorious past, about turning negative episodes from history also into glorious past, which includes the 90s wars, for example. And the hegemonic discourses center on the same as my research, actually, on the Second World War and the 90s wars, where the Yugoslav partisans are appropriated as a Serbian movement, as a Serbian army that was victorious. And then the 90s wars that are looked at through this very narrow lens of Serbian victimhood and heroism. So on the other hand, of course, when we had, although this is very nationalist and nationally oriented memory politics, as it is the case in any other countries, at the same time, we have the EU and Russia, for example, as crucial agents, but also as crucial audiences for Serbia's memory politics. And then this is where I will finish, not to take too much time. of course, official memory politics always performs some positionalities in the international political order. And in the case of Serbia, it is Russia or the EU as memory actors, as intended audiences, but also we have Russia as a very active mnemonic agent when it comes to commemorations of the Second World War. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. I think we can go into some of these topics more deeply. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jelena. That was really great. Now we'll hand over to Jasmin, our last speaker.
Hi. So thanks, everyone, for having me here. I'm going to acknowledge that it is, 7:30 a.m. where I am. So if I seem slightly out of sorts, that'll be why. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation, and I'm very grateful to my learned colleagues for their contributions so far. I come at this topic from a slightly different position, I guess. I mean, I wouldn't call myself as a memory scholar per se, but it is the case that topics concerning memory, and in my case, I would say in particular historical revisionism and negationism, have always been a big part of what I write about and what I think about. Part of that obviously comes from, I think, specifically the Bosnian context as the site of the worst atrocities and worst killings during the context of the Yugoslav War, specifically in the context of the Bosnian genocide, and of course the fact that the negation of the Bosnian genocide has essentially continued without interruption from its earliest days, as in from the earliest days when the genocide was actually occurring, from 1992 all the way up until the present. And obviously there's been ebbs and flows to that tendency. There has been differences in how regional political actors have thought and constructed and responded to the facts of the genocide in Bosnia, in particular in places like Banja Luka and Belgrade and Podgorica to some extent. But nevertheless, it is the case that the dominant tendency historically has been negationism. And I think where some of my recent work is coming from, in particular, is that, something that a lot of us who have been writing and thinking and to one extent or another been activists concerning preserving the memory and creating spaces for commemoration of the Bosnian genocide. One particular tendency that has gained a lot of steam over this last decade, and in particular this last half decade, I would say, is the issue of the growth of negationist and revisionist tendencies in the political West, right? So we know that from, again, the earliest days of the Bosnian War and the Yugoslav dissolution crisis, there were revisionist and negationist tendencies, in particular among the so-called anti-imperialist left, various self-styled, in particular Marxist groups, and various other kinds of left radical groups. This is something that is featured prominently in the work of many renowned, again, self-styled leftist intellectuals, people like Edward Herman, Noam Chomsky, et cetera, nor was, of course, the negationism of the Bosnian genocide, the only sort of major atrocity that individuals like this have continued to negate, undermine, question, revise, et cetera, right? Edward Herman was writing about the Rwandan genocide in similar tones. We know that these tendencies have continued to be very prominent among again, self-styled anti-imperialists in the West as concerns Syria, Ukraine. We're right now watching it happening in the context of the events in Belarus. So this is not a news story per se. My interest in it vis-a-vis the events in Bosnia is that I do think that Bosnia became in some ways a really salient node in the reinvention of post-Cold War politics in the West. And in so much as we've seen over the last, again, decade, half decade a real fragmentation in the kind of proverbial liberal consensus in Europe and the United States. We've seen the reemergence of all kinds of revisionist, reactionary, and even self-styled revolutionary politics in these polities. You know, historical revisionism has reemerged as a constitutive critical element of this political project. And here, again, it's very important that we note that it's not only a phenomenon on the radical left, it's also something that we're seeing increasingly on the far right, right? And in fact, it's the far right, understandably, the far right aspect has gained more currency and more attention, especially when you think about something like the terrorist attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand, where the perpetrator, you know, very prominently is playing with motifs associated either with specifically, you know, particular political figures like Radovan Karadzic, or sort of the broader kind of aesthetic and, dare I even say, quote unquote, intellectual system of Serb ultranationalism, right? And I think the tendency, unfortunately, that we've started seeing, and that those of us who are, you know, kind of maintain this local posture in the region, in Bosnia, etc., you know, that we've started seeing is, and this is, again, I think the kind of divergence that we're seeing with previous generations of Western revisionism vis-a-vis the genocide and the broader Yugoslav crisis, we're starting to see a certain kind of intertwining between left-wing anti-imperialist narratives in the West, far-right narratives in the West, and local nationalist revisionist narratives, right? So you're actually starting to see these three things kind of coalesce, not in a particularly coherent way, not in a kind of systematic way, not to suggest that they're all pushing towards the same end, as it were, but it is happening in fashion that is alarming, and I think does reflect some much bigger and much broader political changes that are happening in Europe, in the United States, but also, of course, in the region itself. So the kind of the final thing to say here, and to leave more time for my colleagues and obviously for the question, I think the place that I come at these questions from is, on the one hand, a place that, you know, is a little bit skeptical of the idea of memory to begin with, because from, you know, to be quite blunt, from the position of, I think, many genocide survivors in Bosnia and their allies, there has never been an opportunity to memorialize. Memory implies that an event has passed, and that, you know, we now have space and time to commemorate and think about it in the past tense. I think for many people, you know, in particular returnee communities in places like Eastern Bosnia, Northeastern Bosnia, this is an ongoing event. And this is an event through which you can trace continuation. And I think for my thinking as a political scientist in particular, and somebody who kind of works at all these slightly bizarre intersections of IR and comparative and you know, even sociology to some extent, and who has this kind of very outward-facing academic profile, I think the thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how you build coalitions and how you build communities to recognize the ongoing nature of these events and these politics, and also, to be quite blunt, I mean, how you prepare for the possibility of a resumption of some degree of violence, or at the very least some degree of overtly coercive politics, in light of the fact that I think so much of the assumptions that we had about the nature of the international system have really evaporated very, very quickly and very, very profoundly over much of the last, again, decade, but half decade in particular. So that's sort of where I am intellectually on this issue, and I will mute myself at this point.
Thanks very much. That was really great. So I think the three speakers have provided a very interesting overview of some of the complexities and I guess indeed contestations within Southeast Europe and its memory politics, and also I guess begun to think of some of its kind of transnational and global currents. So what we'll do now is take some questions. We are hoping to take these in rounds of 3 and then give the speakers a chance to respond, perhaps just in the order that they spoke. So if you have a question, please indicate so by typing in the chat or raising your hand on the Zoom function. Katarina?
Yeah, I think if we don't have questions from the audience yet, I think I can comment with a few questions. Thank you to all of the panelists for such insightful discussions. And I also have to admit that I come at this, of course, as like anyone working in Southeast Europe, it's always kind of in around what I studied, but I never really studied memory politics. So I apologize if the questions are less learned than the contributions. But I was really wondering about, well, many things, but I'm gonna start with 2 particular things. One is to kind of continue around these kind of global currents and global echoes that I think all of you kind of reflected on. So my one question will be, is there something that's quite specific about memory politics in Southeast Europe? And I think this is what Anna, when you were saying about the kind of the comparisons of the different cases and whether that is strange or not strange, or why it should be strange or not, or it shouldn't be strange. What are the tensions there, and what kind of work should we be doing in this kind of, I don't know if it's a comparative, but also like this thinking together. And I ask this for 2 reasons. My first reason is that when I first came to the UK and realized how colonialism is understood in basically in school curricula, and when I got my first batch of essays to mark, I realized that, you know, facing the past is not just something that Southeast Europe needs to do, but it's a much more global phenomenon. So I was always kind of curious about this, how I think in Southeast Europe, there is this narrative that it's just Southeast Europe that needs to face the past, but I think it's a much wider phenomenon. And secondly, I think especially the events this year, the tearing down of the statue in Bristol, I mean, watching this, I've had several people text me, it's like, so how do you as an Eastern European feel about this statue coming down? So I would also kind of ask you to kind of just maybe reflect or connect to these things. And then I think we have other questions, so we can come back. Thank you.
So should I first start in order of presenting? Yeah.
I think we don't have any other questions at this moment. So yeah, why not take a round of responses?
Okay. So, well, thank you, Katarina, for this question. I'm happy to elaborate on this issue, actually on any issue that involves memory and statues and monuments in particular. So what comes to my mind is actually, you know, when you say like, how can I compare certain cases and what kind of things these regions or countries have in common? Of course, when we think about Southeast Europe, it's a region that shares a number of similarities among countries in terms of historical experiences. So, but when it comes to facing the past, as you say, it's a global phenomenon, and I guess at the end, it all depends to what kind of purpose do you assign to facing the past. So why we need to face the past? Do we need to face the past because we need to offer a promise of non-reoccurrence, like in the case of the Holocaust, so that these events never happen again? Do we need to face the past because we need to offer symbolic recognition for the victims, even of the events that happened so many years ago, like the victims, the people who died in the colonial era in England or in Netherlands or elsewhere? So everything comes down to what kind of purpose we do assign to, I guess, facing the past. So there have been a number of attempts of reconciling divergent versions of history and different kind of views on the past. So for instance, as Jelena also mentioned, the European Union has been playing really important part in this process over the years, especially since the end of the Cold War. So in relation to the EU enlargement, when it went to the Central Eastern Europe, okay, we had this kind of competing views on the past of the Second World and what happened afterwards. So the European Union played a really important role in reconciling these two divergent views on that history of the Eastern and Western Europe, to simplify actually what has been happening. So this is another way of using the past and dealing with the past, or facing the past, in order to pacify the tensions. But always the problem, of course, is what are the outcomes? Whether we really actually, by using this official politics of memory, by making resolutions, by making monuments, by organizing these transnational commemorations, whether we actually are achieving that objective of reconciling divergent points of view on the past. So I'm going to stop here and leave time for others to elaborate on this topic.
We do have a couple of questions that came in, so maybe I'll read them out. So I think, Catherine, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, I mean, okay, if I can make this actually sound like a question. It was more reflection that came to mind as you were speaking, and thinking back to some of the some of the examples that our speakers have been talking about. I think one of the most transformative political experiences probably of my life was researching memory and historical revisionism in Croatia in particular as a white British postgrad. And this was at the time that Croatia was under pressure to cooperate with the ICTY, etc. And okay, so normatively, if coming to terms with historical revisionism and past violence is something Croatia needs to do as a society, how much more is that the case in my own society? So when you were saying it's not just Southeast Europe that needs to do this, I really couldn't agree more with that. I guess to turn this into a question for any speakers who want it, what more can be done, and by whom, to connect up these dimensions of these dimensions of dealing with the past?
Thank you, Catherine. And I'll just read out the other two questions that we got in the chat, and then we can continue with the panelists. So one question, I think it's partially Anna already addressed it, from Angelica Vascotto. So when developing the research for your paper, what have been the challenges in comparing the three different cases, if there were challenges? And then another question from Jasna Dragovic, also from Goldsmiths. It's for Jelena. So could you please tell us more about Russia as a mnemonic actor in Serbia, and what forms has this taken, and what are its main modes of action? Who exactly are the vectors and the recipients of this mnemonic activity? And what is its content in terms of the narratives articulated? So maybe now we can go back to the panelists and then continue collecting questions.
Should I continue now, or okay? I will first address one specificity that Katarina asked about regarding memory in Southeast Europe, and then reply to Jasna's question. So as soon as you asked this question, this was my first thought about anti-communism, and this, what I'm going to say, has caused several misunderstandings at different conferences dealing with post-socialism, because when we talk about Serbia, any kind of critique of Yugoslav state socialism, any kind of focus on dealing with the past, dealing with some of the negative aspects, dealing with the repressive time immediately after the Second World War, was completely hijacked by the right-wing and far-right groups and political elites. And this, all of these groups also that I studied, at the same time, always in all of their acts of commemorations involve, or legal actions or anything, always involve defeated Second World War forces, different ones, from Milan Nedić, the prime minister in occupied Serbia, to Chetniks, who are this very ambiguous movement, of course. And then I was looking at it that in the 90s, well, that has something to do with the 90s wars as well, because while this anti-communist and Chetnik memory community was coming to being in Serbia in the early 90s, liberal civil society, anti-nationalist civil society, and different actors had the breakup of Yugoslavia and the wars to deal with. And these different human rights violations that took place in socialist Yugoslavia, especially in its early period, were completely hijacked by these different groups and political parties that came to being. And this persisted also after the fall of Slobodan Milošević. So today, no one wants to look at anything. We don't have any kind of, we have some kind of victims associations dealing with Goli Otok or crimes of communism. They were all, for example, proposing judicial rehabilitation of Milan Nedić and Dragoljub Mihajlović. So, and I talked to all of them, and these are mostly right-wing and far-right actors who sometimes have some kind of family connections to some of the events of the post-war period, but mostly their motivation is also very much political. And at the same time, so as I said, there is no critical engagement with any of these topics coming from some other actors. And this is, I think this is very specific and causes many misunderstandings at conferences when I talk about the associations of victims of communism and political prisoners that are very much far right in Serbia. And I'm in the panel with people who do oral history, with families of people who were in gulags, for example. And then I seem like very, as if I'm making fun of all of that or something like that, which actually my civil society actors that I look at are completely different than these. And when it comes to Russia as an actor, there are different, when it comes to celebrations of the Victory Day and the Day of Liberation in Belgrade, those are the most prominent examples. Russian diplomats always co-organize and take place in these events. If there are some flowers to be laid at the cemetery of Belgrade Liberators or on the main square, it is always together with the Russian ambassador. No other ambassadors take part in these practices otherwise, just the Russian one. And I saw some examples in the Milošević period when they were ambassadors of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia taking part sometimes in some of the commemorations. So this is kind of, then there was that wasn't the case after the fall of Milošević, but now again it is. And the immortal regiment is for me one of the most interesting phenomena that I study at the moment as well, because this emerged as a grassroots and diaspora practice in Russia, where people are carrying, as you most of you probably know, portraits of their ancestors who fought in the Second World War mostly, or who were victims, and march through different places, cities, and so on. This became a huge thing in Serbia, but also in Republika Srpska and Montenegro. And this is, but here, this is not grassroots, but it is also organized by the state actors, and state actors are in this board that organizes it. But at the same time, some people take part in it very happily. They just join, even though they are not really maybe supporters of the current government. So this is for me something most interesting. When it comes to narratives, they're quite similar. The appropriation of the People's Liberation War in the Serbian context is very much similar to the memory of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War narrative in Russia, which means these armies are depoliticized. They are no longer multi-ethnic. They became Russian and Serbian armies. And it is all about the heroism of the nation, militarism in commemorative practices, in speeches, and so on. Ministries of defense in both countries play a very important part. So it is very, very similar. And we can also see it in several other countries, such as Belarus, the same kind of military parades, same kind of narrative. These multi-ethnic and armies always turn into very, very ethnic Russian, Serbian, or Belarusian armies and victories of these nations in the Second World War.
Shall we hear from Jasmin? And then I think we have a few more questions. Sorry, then I'll let you go on.
Oh, that's fine. And I know there's also a question here from Audrey Reeves for me, so I'll address that in a sec. But I wanted to just chime in on the earlier question about sort of the specificity, I think, of memory politics in the Western Balkans and Southeastern Europe. I mean, look, so I live in California right now. For the previous 3 years or so, my family and I were living in North Carolina. And every day when I drove to work on the campus where I was teaching, pretty much every day I would pass Confederate flags, other kinds of sort of, you know, the lost cause of the South memorabilia. There was a Klan rally about a month and a half before last September's start of the semester. Are there revisionist politics and sort of contested memory politics in, you know, the quote unquote developed West? Of course there are, in particular in a place like the United States, where, you know, we're watching everything that's happening in this country right now, not only obviously with this administration and its kind of revisionist tendencies down to its sloganeering, right, make America great again, but obviously, you know, systematic violence against African Americans and people of color. And we know this, right? And obviously for the British colleagues who've been thinking a lot about colonialism and imperial legacies, we know there are transatlantic echoes of all of this. I think the specificity in particular when I'm thinking about the Western Balkan context, though, is that you know, revisionist tendencies, as I was stating earlier, continue to be a, you know, I mean, at the risk of being slightly hyperbolic, and I don't actually think this is hyperbolic, revisionist accounts of the Yugoslav dissolution and a lot of recent Balkan history continue to be mainstream, right? We talk about them as revisionist, but when we're talking about the nature and the fashion in which these themes are discussed in places like, for instance, the RS entity in Bosnia, revisionist accounts are the mainstream, right? And they are also the official political line, right? Revisionist positions are the official political line of the regime in Banja Luka. They're the official line of the regime in Belgrade, right? Especially when you're thinking about things like, for instance, the Bosnian genocide. But it obviously extends, as Jelena in particular was saying, right, to things like World War II, even World War I, and then obviously we don't even need to go into the whole sort of mythologization of the Ottoman period, even the Austro-Hungarian period, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is the specificity in some ways, that kind of revisionism remains a politically salient feature of contemporary politics in the region, in some places more so than others. You know, I think Catherine's notes about Croatia were well taken, and we've seen some definite relapses there. We see different aspects of it in places like Kosovo and Albania as well, but you know, there it is. To Audrey's question here, you know, so she asks, can you please say more about the constitutive role of negationism in the post-Cold War liberal order? What I mean by that is that as we're seeing the fragmentation of what we can, again, kind of generously refer to as the liberal order or Atlanticism, liberal democracy is kind of the ideological mainstream of at least Western politics. As that has begun to weaken, as that has begun to fragment, new political projects are attempting to emerge. And one of oftentimes the kind of main imperatives of any new political project and new political movement is to write its own version of the past, to write its own version of history, in particular if it is a again, kind of fundamentally revisionist project, which is to say, if it is specifically trying to contest and challenge the legitimacy of the preceding regime. Right? Sometimes regimes evolve and you can sort of borrow things from one and each other and build on top of each other. But when you have the emergence, as you're seeing in places like the United States, Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, other countries that we could add, the emergence of kind of right-wing populist nationalist regimes for whom the reimagining of history is such a critical feature of their imagined future, then you begin to understand why negationism becomes so important. And when you're thinking specifically about the context of the Bosnian War and the Yugoslav dissolution and the Bosnian genocide, I think the centrality of that, realistically speaking, rather obscure conflict for things like the Western anti-imperialist left or even the Western far right, who do actually imagine themselves to be in a position in the relatively near future to actually take power. And in the case of the Western far right, in some places have essentially taken power already, either explicitly or maintain very close links to people in the halls of power, as it were. For them, the importance of revisiting narratives and accounts of, again, the context of the Yugoslav dissolution is because that traditionally has been marked and talked about and written about as the kind of high watermark of the post-Cold War liberal order. Right? When you go back to the literature and academia in the 90s and early 2000s, and you read about Bosnia, Kosovo, Yugoslavia, et cetera, that was the halcyon period of everything, the West could do. The United States, the European Union, state building, institution building, peace building, democratization, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a really, really important part of everything that I think some of these new kind of, at the very least, anti-establishment actors are trying to revisit. They have a big chip on their shoulder about the notion of state building, globalization, all of these kinds of intersections that you can draw through, I think, Western narratives and accounts of the Yugoslav dissolution. And so for them, it's very, very important, not just to kind of challenge and revisit this topic, but also in particular to, I think, imbue them with a certain kind of falseness, even conspiracism, right? Because, I mean, their whole thing is that they're trying to delegitimize the liberal project essentially from top to bottom, right? So that's why you see this tendency towards conspiracism on both the far left and the far right, because it's not sufficient to say, for instance, that like, oh, hey, the Dayton Agreement is contested, there's some challenges about it, oh, is ethnic politics really the way to build peace in a country after genocide, all these kind of thoughtful debates that we could have. Instead, what you say is, well, no, actually, you see, it's all part of one grand imperial project, because in the halls of the West and imperial power centers, the thing that's most important is dominating Kosovo and Bosnia, which, who can find them on a map? This is the thing. Like, there's a tendency. I mean, I think for us, this reeks of absurdism, but I think what we've begun seeing, in the real world, as it were, over the last few years, is actually how much salience these kinds of conspiratorial narratives have with a great deal of the public, right? So these kinds of narratives, in that sense, are very, very politically effective, and they have become increasingly so. I'll stop there because I could talk about this for a long time.
Okay, I think we have another couple of questions from the chat. So I'll just read that one out, and if anyone else has questions in the meantime, please do type it in the chat or raise your hand in the chat function, because I can't see everyone's face. So if you're waving at me, I probably can't see it. Okay, so 2 questions which are addressed to the 3 speakers. First, what is the role of the ICC as an external judicial actor in influencing those competing discourses in Bosnia and Serbia? And second, what is the current trend of the methodological development while studying memory politics? Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. Katarina, did you have also a question to add to that? Before we hand over to...
I just have a quick one, and it's a bit of a weird one, because I think in the context, especially after Jasmin spoke about kind of the revisionism and denialism that still is prevalent in the region, especially when it comes to the Bosnian genocide, but I think other issues as well. But I wanted to ask about the kind of how we choose the topics that we study, not just topics that are memorialized, but kind of memory studies as an academic practice. And I ask this for very selfish reasons, is because I'm a part of many initiatives in which that are trying to think about how to basically shake up knowledge production about the Balkans and in the Balkans. And within that, there's a lot of talk about excavating subjugated histories and basically focusing on histories that that are not so obvious and not so well known. And I ask this because, for example, even in our event, which is kind of broadly framed as memory, we still end up talking about the wars, and very specifically, and I mean, we have many wars to talk about, but still it's very kind of war centric. So I was wondering, did you notice, or is there a move to talk about, I don't know, Roma or Sinti histories or LGBTQI histories in the region, or any kind of other histories that also change kind of the subject that we focus on? Thank you.
So maybe we'll proceed again in the order of the speakers, and if you can try to keep your interventions relatively short, because we don't have so much time left. So I'll hand over to Anna.
Yeah. Well, maybe first to address the question that Katarina asked. Yeah, of course, there is, we are not always going along ethnic lines, as Jasmin said, in the research on memory studies, especially on the wars or the history of the region. So there are many, many interesting projects that have been done at the moment, and what also recently in the region, that deal with memory. So I will just mention maybe there are a lot of researchers working on digital memory, digital commemoration, which is something completely new. There are a lot of researchers that are dealing actually with the role of peace, which is something that we keep on forgetting because we tend to focus on anniversaries and monuments and dealing with the past and transitional justice. But actually, there are actually activists who were, even in the times of the war, actually working on peace projects. So there are many, many. Yeah, of course, digital memory is not new. Yeah, digital memory is not new, somebody's saying, but it is really interesting, this kind of digital memorial activism that is actually happening over the last decades, as Nella said. But there are a number of really, really interesting papers that are trying to define and go more into theory about what actually memorial activism is and how it relates with digital technologies. So I'm going to stop there.
I'm going to, I wouldn't be so positive and optimistic as Anna. I think there is still need to diversify memory studies on the region, because we still, and I'm also guilty for that, of course, we still focus, when it comes to the 20th century, it's the First, the Second World War and the 90s. It is, I think, the very classic approach still dominates. I think we will still see some, because even the work done on digital memory activism is still about the 90s and about civil society dealing with the 90s. So I think new approaches to memory of these events as well are more than necessary. And I would just shortly say something about the role of ICTY rather than ICC in memory politics. If you look at, I think the biggest importance of the ICTY when it comes to memory is its value is, I think, the biggest for civil society, because it gave them more, I think it pushed civil society more into doing many things. It also gave a lot of documentation, a lot of victims' testimonies, a lot of materials that can be used to confront the dominant revisionist narratives, genocide denial, and all other problems that are just keep growing. However, if you look at the official level, one might say that all that work has been in vain on that level, because there is no, we can't see any influence of the ICTY, of the work, investigative work, and the judicial work of the ICTY in official memory politics in any of the countries. Well, no positive effect anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo Jelena's comments on the ICTY, in particular, the role that it has played for victims and survivors, establishing a clear historical record. Even if we do take the position that there were shortcomings with the ICTY, it didn't go far enough. In particular, in recognizing the systematic nature of the crimes of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Right. I mean, this is why I use the term the genocide in Bosnia or the Bosnian genocide rather than the genocide in Srebrenica. Though I obviously do use that term as well in that specific context, because Srebrenica was but one place where those crimes took place. And you can't tell me that, what happened in Foča or Visegrad or Banja Luka or Bijeljina or all of which were part of exactly the same political project, were not part of one, comprehensive campaign, hence the term the Bosnian genocide. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm a political scientist, and for me, this comes down to politics. I mean, there is fundamentally no political will, as Jelena was saying, and as I was saying earlier myself, the political mainstream in much of the region remains fundamentally revisionist. So obviously, for them, it's very important to reject, marginalize, obscure the findings of the ICTY and any other relevant international tribunals, or for that matter, actually, the kind of international academic and scholarly consensus. I mean, when you're thinking about things like we have happening right now in the RS entity, where they are convening these faux academic commissions to revisit, analyze, investigate the truth of the genocide in Srebrenica, right? And again, it's from politically constituted, it's from the top down, it's being done by the Dodik regime. We've had similar things, similar publications emerging, for instance, from the Ministry of Defense in Serbia, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, these are political decisions, right? This is coming from on high, as it were. And so long as that remains the case, it's very difficult to imagine that there's going to be any kind of, whatever, truth and reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera. I also completely agree that, the experiences and the discourse about memory politics tends to disproportionately marginalize, experiences of LGBT communities, Roma communities, people, any kinds of peoples and communities that don't fit sort of the established narratives and the established parameters of the debate. I'm very, very cautiously optimistic that there has begun to be some evolution in that sense, at least at the local level. I thought it was very interesting, for instance, for those of you who kept up with it, the context in which the so-called Bleiberg mass in Sarajevo, how prominently LGBT activists in particular were involved in challenging that event, how you saw this kind of very interesting intertwining of the sort of the anti-fascist legacy of the Yugoslav period with contemporary LGBT struggles and kind of contemporary civil society discourses in Bosnia and Herzegovina. To one extent you can say, okay, well, these are all, civil society, civic oriented people, LGBT people, anti-fascists, whatever. These are all marginalized communities in Bosnia. So, all seven of them got together. But that's the cynical take, and I don't want to take that take. I do think that, the thing that I want to end on here, I mean, I think one of the things that's happening and that we're not always aware of is that there is a little bit of a generational shift happening. It is slow, but it is happening. And it's not to say that the upcoming generations are better or more progressive. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying biologically, there's a transition happening in our generations. Those of us, for instance, like myself, who were kids during the Yugoslav wars, we're now more or less fully formed adults with children of our own. There are kids who are coming into adulthood who weren't even born during the Yugoslav wars. So there are now layers upon layers of memory, contestation, and sort of intersection with various kinds of political projects that are reshaping and reanimating these debates, both in the context of the Yugoslav wars and still earlier periods, again, as I think both Jelena and Anna were noting.
So now actually we have 10 minutes left, so we've answered a little bit too quickly. So maybe I can jump in and respond a little bit to something Anna was talking about, but kind of frame it a bit more into a question. I think it's absolutely right to be talking about how people have been doing kind of grassroots peace building for a very long time. but in my experience of working on my postdoc project, which is part of a larger project called The Art of Peace, this language of peace is also quite difficult when you bring it up in interview situations in Bosnia. So for participants, when you talk about peace, automatically, I guess the thought or the conversation turns to a very, I guess, stale and stagnant version of kind of inter-ethnic reconciliation, perhaps kind of imposed by NGO frameworks. So I guess the question is how, and to kind of frame it more in terms of the questions of memory that we've been talking about in the panel, how does our language matter when we're kind of interviewing people about these topics? What kinds of language should we be using? Yeah, I'll leave it there. And if anyone wants to respond, that's absolutely fine.
Maybe I can start responding to that, and then I'll pass the potato to others. Well, talking about peace in the Balkans especially, I'm not talking about Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans especially, it's like talking about reconciliation. Everybody has an idea about what it is and how it should be done, but nobody agrees upon the minimum common, you know, like denominator on what is actually reconciliation and how we should go around it. Because, you know, like next year, 2021, we will be celebrating, making an anniversary, 30 years since the war in Yugoslavia started. So 30 years, let that sink in, 30 years. And we still have no minimum common denominators. We still don't have a common narrative among the countries in the Balkans on what this war was actually about. Not to talk about a common guidelines or common ideas on how the future should be built and how the mistakes should be corrected and how we should go about truth and justice and reconciliation, etc., etc. Because in my own understanding from the let's say grassroots perspective, from the NGO perspective, they have been always clashing with these kind of official narratives, official mnemonic, official memory politics, because we should always remember that wars for memory, wars for truth about what happened in the past are power struggles. So those who control the narrative about the past, they also have the power. So I'm also gonna stop here. I'm gonna pass the ball to Jasmin and Jelena.
I don't know really what to say. Thank you, Anna, for passing it to me. When it comes to peace, well, my question is also what kind of peace and how sustainable it is with this kind of incompatible and exclusivist narratives that dominate each and every country and ethnic community. So this is not really the peace that we want, I guess. There is obviously no armed conflict, but still there is prevailing revisionism is a huge problem and leads to various conflicts that take place in the political and memory field as well. So yeah, I think Jasmin will have something more, maybe more optimistic to add, or more analytical at least.
But before we move to Jasmin, could I just step in, because I think Jelena would be a good person to ask. We got another question in the chat. Sorry for interrupting, but I do think that you're the right person since you also work in civil society. So the question is about the political economy of memory. And I'm mainly thinking about the economic purposes of memorialization activities and the patrimonialization of memories, memorials, etc. How much is that dimension studies, and how does it influence the emergence of hegemonic memories as well as civil society activism? So if you could just shortly as you want, reflect on that.
I studied this question on the example of anti-communist memory activism from below. And this is when it comes to political economy of memory politics from below, the Serbian Orthodox Church is, for example, a very important actor, because as you all know, it is, you cannot really build a memorial wherever you want, and it has to be permitted by someone, it has to be paid by someone. So in the case of Chetnik memory community, for example, it is the political emigration that financed most of the memorials that exist. But the church is the crucial agent in the Serbian case as well, because in the cases where it is not possible to build a Chetnik memorial on the public ground, such as the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you have to have some kind of consensus, like in Brčko, where a monument of Draža Mihajlović was removed, these memorials are then built, such as the case with the golden Draža Mihajlović memorial from Brčko. It was moved to a monastery property near Visegrad. So the church allows, on its private property, it allows these memorials to be built. And this is very important to understand. However, in Serbia, it is also local municipalities very often allow such memorials, but they do not want to pay for them. So it is usually the emigration community, the diaspora actually, that pays for it. And then a political party such as the Serbian Renewal Movement of Vuk Drašković collects and organizes these finances. And this is the case in dozens of, this is the case with the dozens of memorials related to the Chetnik movement or groups considered victims of communism that I traced across Serbia. So no state support in this case, but and also no public presence in the sense of media and everything. I think people mostly don't know that there are these memorials actually everywhere.
I think now it has come to be my turn for the buck passing and the rolling downhill. It's a good question, just to go back to the previous discussion. I guess I want to focus on the sort of the role of activists, and in particular, I think Western academics and activists, to sort of echo something that Lydia was mentioning. I mean, I think I have to say, from a kind of basic moral and ethical standpoint, part of the reason why I've sort of started thinking more seriously and systematically about the nature of Western forms of negationism and revisionism is because you know, I've begun to recognize it as a really dominant theme in the actually existing world, you know, especially when you're thinking about, for instance, and I'm not going to name any names, but I trust that all of you will know who I'm speaking about. You know, just very recently, we had a book come out, which was a long series of interviews with Radovan Karadzic by a rather prominent Western intellectual, which was, I mean, it's an extraordinary book. I mean, I have rarely been more horrified by, you know, an ostensibly academic text, because it's, you know, it's literally somebody documenting their own transformation into a believer of conspiracy theories and revisionist accounts. And this is by ostensibly a very learned scholar of extremist movements, right? So if somebody like Radovan Karadzic can essentially entice, transform, you know, I don't know, I mean, for those of you who have read any portions of the book, I mean, I really shudder at this language, but at times it's almost erotic, right? I mean, the relationship that this person describes with this, you know, the architect of the Bosnian genocide it's unbelievable. And I'll say also for the record, you know, I have had an exchange with this person, and I'm not saying anything here that I have not said to this person point blank. It's extraordinary to me. So when things like that can happen, right? When things like that can happen with, again, very, very prominent scholars of extremism, what can we expect from young people, but also the general public who, you know, again, for whom, realistically speaking, Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, I mean, they might as well be the moon, right? So somebody saying to them, well, look, oh, you you know, things weren't actually like you've been told, the deep state and the fake news media and blah, 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 blah. You know, and again, most of it these days is happening in the service of kind of domestic political agendas in the political West, but it's having a dramatic effect on attempts to preserve the actual lived memory of communities of survivors, et cetera, et cetera. So all of which is a roundabout way of saying, I think for those of you who do study memory, who are not from the region, who are interested in these politics, I think it's really important that we recognize that this is an ongoing issue, and that this is an issue that you have a certain kind of ethical and moral responsibility when you study it. This is not the kind of thing that you can study in the abstract. These are real lives, these are real communities, these have profound contemporary effects. And I would urge all of us to think about our scholarship and our work as something that aims to protect and give back to vulnerable communities, whoever those communities may be. And it's different depending on the context. And again, we can talk about specifically, you know, LGBT experiences, Roma experiences, all of that matters. You know, bring that ethics and responsibility to your work, because it really, really matters, and it's beginning to matter, unfortunately, more and more.
Okay, and we'll just hear very briefly from Anna in response to the questions, and then Lydia will close. So we are running a few minutes over time, so sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, but because Anna, she asked a really, really interesting question, and I actually kind of like wrote paper on this, but I'm still in the process of publishing. It's about utilitarian value of memory. So it kind of relates to this economic aspect of memory, and I was examining in particular the role of memory in diplomacy. So what comes to my mind when she asked this question was actually, you know, this kind of Disneyfication process that comes also in play with the memory, because we always think of memory as remembering something that actually happened, that is in relation to our collective imagining of community, of nation, of how we see ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. But what we have seen recently, especially in Serbia, is this process of memorializing events and persons that have no connection whatsoever with the country. And for instance, this was motivated by economic reasons, you know, like if the government wants to build an economic relationship with China, they will rename the boulevard, the main boulevard, the boulevard of Sino-Serbian friendship. They will make a monument for a Chinese, I don't know, a philosopher, or in relation to Azerbaijan, which has been, you know, really, really important economic actor in the region, not only in Serbia. Serbian government has built, I think, 2 now monuments, not only one in Novi Sad, one in Belgrade, in Novi Beograd. They made 2 monuments for the father of the president of Azerbaijan. So this is this process of, you know, like clearly using memory and memorialization for this kind of economic purposes. This is what it comes to my mind as, you know, when we talk about, you know, what kind of values memorialization can have. And we should not absolutely forget that, you know, people use and political establishment can use memory for a lot of different kind of purposes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. So I guess that brings today's discussion to a close. I'd just like to thank our 3 speakers, Anna, Jelena, and Jasmin. Thank you for your really insightful comments and yeah, really great responses to questions. And also thank you to everyone at BISA for supporting us administratively. The conversation couldn't really happen without you. Yeah, so I guess that brings us to a close. Katarina, did you want to say anything?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And just remember that you can also follow us on Twitter, or if you are interested in organizing events on any broad topic that might be related to our group, do email us and do get in touch and we can work on something together. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.